The Intel NUC was launched all the way back in 2013, and 8 years later, I have the latest and maybe greatest of what it has to bring. Hi there everyone, it's Mike from SABRENT, and if you enjoy tech videos then make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you stay updated. The Intel NUC was designed to bring small desktop computing to the masses, basically Intel's answer to the Mac Mini. The Intel NUC can be used for productivity, internet surfing, and even as part of a home theatre setup. Let's start off with design. And this thing is small, like small enough to the point that you can actually mount this thing to the back of your monitor with the included VESA mount. The dimensions are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and the motherboard is only 4 by 4 inches, which is really hard to believe. But don't let this small size fool you, because this thing does pack a small punch. Inside has the latest 10nm 11th gen Intel i7 processor, which is the 1185G7. The base clock on this is 3 GHz and can turbo boost all the way up to 4.8 GHz, but I will get into how it performs later, so keep watching. Paired with this is 16GB of DDR4 SODIMM RAM, clocked at 32 MHz. I/O for a productivity machine can be very important, and this has a lot of I/O. Up at the front we have two 3.2 Gen 2 USB, which gives up to 10 gigabit per second speeds, and then around the back we get one more as well as a USB 2.0 port. Then we have two USB-C ports, the first one being Thunderbolt 4 and DisplayPort 1.4a compatible, and then the second one is Thunderbolt 3 and Display 1.4a compatible. We also get two dual HDMI 2.0b with HDMI CEC, and lastly the DC power. The HDMI ports or the display ports can support one 8K display or two 4K displays, but you can actually connect up 4 monitors to this thing if you really needed to, just lower the resolution. It also comes with a 2.5G Ethernet port, which is really nice to see because a lot of these machines sometimes come with a 1 gigabit Ethernet port, so it's nice to see that we're starting to get 2.5 really across the industry now. What's odd is that we don't get any speakers or headphone ports, which I thought that if this was aimed for business with its Intel vPro features, then why wouldn't you include these two ports? Plus, the type of monitor that you would typically find in an office would be one that wouldn't include speakers. So, I mean, it is very easy to add that I feel like they could have done. There is a way to include it by using one of our very popular SABRENT USB to audio adapters, either the USB-A version or USB-C version. And lastly, accompanying the 2.5 Ethernet port, if you don't want to be wired in, then you get Wi-Fi 6, which is really fast. Now, you don't get any peripherals in the box, but you do have Bluetooth 5.2, so that if you don't want to be wired in and keep things aesthetic, you can just use the Bluetooth connection to connect up some Bluetooth peripherals. You have Windows 10 Pro installed, which can be updated to Windows 11 when it's publicly available, as this does have Secure Boot and TPM 2.0, which is essential for Windows 11. Now, while we're speaking of upgradability, this little machine does have some. So the processor is soldered in to the board. However, the RAM is upgradable up to 64 gigabytes, and then we have 3 PCIe slots, one of them being a Gen 4 slot, which has our SABRENT 500 gigabyte Rocket Gen 4 SSD, and then we have 2 PCIe Gen 3 slots. Now, let's get into performance. First of all, this has the SABRENT Rocket 4 SSD built into this NUC. Here we have the 500 gigabyte model, which is based on Toshiba's TLC NAND flash memory. Its performance speeds can reach up to 5,000 megabytes on the read and 2,500 megabytes writes using a PCIe Gen 4 motherboard, and the slot in this thing is PCIe Gen 4. So let's see how this board handles our SSD. Starting with the Atto disk benchmark, as you can see we are getting very close to the advertised speeds, and then looking at Crystal Diskmark we are basically seeing 500 megabytes per second reads and just over 2,500 megabyte per second writes. The 4K random and write speeds are also very impressive. Now let's talk about the CPU and GPU, because there's no dedicated graphics, but this has Intel's latest 11th gen CPU with their best yet Intel Intel Xe graphics. So what's it like to use in everyday use? First, let's start with some benchmarks and then get into some real world tests. In Geekbench, the CPU test, we see a single core score performance of 1451, which is pretty good, meaning that for everyday general tasks like productivity, this is going to sell through it. In the multi-core score, we see 4978, which again, for multiple app switching, you'll be pretty safe with this type of CPU. Now, let's push the CPU a little bit harder with Cinebench R23, which pushes the CPU hard for at least 10 minutes to see how the thermals perform. On the single core test, we got 1465, and the multi-core, we got 5344. Now, the single core score is pretty impressive, beating the Ryzen 9 4900H, and is on par with the Apple M1 chip. However, the multi-core score performance falls a little bit behind both chips. Now, this is down to its lower core count and also in part down to its lower TDP. But what do you expect in this small of a machine? Looking at the Geekbench Vulkan and OpenCL tests, it's almost on par with a GTX 760 Ti, but falls behind Apple's M1 integrated GPU, which is similar to a GTX 1050. I ran the Blender, BMW and Classroom tests, and the results weren't actually too bad. Now, let's use 3D Mark to see how the temperatures, clock speeds and loads are like under different tests. So I fired up 3D Mark and I'm doing a screen recording from a second PC just to not affect the results. Now, I have run these tests a few times and I thought it was really interesting. So let's first of all start off with the CPU profile, and as you can see, it just benchmarks modern processors. So let's run the test and let me go into the results. So the CPU profile test is wrapped up, but let's take a look at some of the monitoring details. So first of all, as you can see, as it's loading up, we see it sort of peak to its maximum boost clock at 4795 megahertz. But as you can see, we start to see the temperatures rise to over 90 degrees for most of the maximum thread test. And we are seeing clock speeds of about 4,300. And then when we get into the other tests, so more importantly, sort of the 4 threads test, as you can see, it peaks to 100 degrees on the CPU, with the clock speeds hitting around 4,200 megahertz. So I would have either preferred to have seen the clock speeds drop a little bit for the sake of temperatures, because yeah, pushing the system to over 90 degrees for a lot of the test definitely wasn't good. And then as you can see, it sort of reacts to it and then drops it to sort of around 3,800 megahertz, with temperatures being around 70 degrees. But to see that hit 100 degrees was definitely a bit worrying. And then again, we see it peak to 100 degrees for several points in the test as well. So even the 2-threaded test, we see it again peak to nearly 100 degrees, again touching 100 degrees. And I mean, fair play to the 11th gen processor. It's definitely holding it at sort of 4,200 to 4,300, but those temperatures, it just makes me think that for CPU intensive workloads, this should definitely be avoided. So even though these Intel CPUs can run up to 100 degrees, you definitely don't want it there. You want it to be around 80 degrees at full tilt. Obviously lower the better, but typically with systems like this, you don't want it to be creeping over 85 degrees, that's for sure. And we can definitely see that being affected here. So Intel are definitely keeping clock speeds higher at the cost of CPU temperature, something that we've tend to seen Apple do with their computers. They tend to run a little bit hotter in favor for more performance, so we're definitely seeing that with the Intel Nook. Now throughout the test, I did hear the fans kick in, but I'll speak about that later on. So now let's run Night Raid, and this is a specific test for PCs with integrated graphics, which obviously the Intel Nook is. So let's run the test and see how it gets on. So the night raid test is all completed and we've got a score of 13,738. But more importantly, how did the Intel Nook perform in a GPU intensive workload? Well, first of all, with the graphics test 1, not too bothered with the frames per second or anything like that, but let's take a look at the CPU and GPU temperatures. So they hover around 55 degrees throughout the first test, but as you can see, the GPU load is pretty much at 100% throughout the test. Taking a look at the CPU clock frequency, it bounces between 3,500, maybe 3,800 earlier on in the test to a maximum of 4,400. When it comes to the GPU memory clock's frequency and the GPU clock frequency, we are seeing it hover around the 1200 MHz to 1100 MHz respectively. And then we're seeing the same story when it comes to the graphics test 2. So again, maximum load on the GPU. The CPU in this test isn't probably being used as much, and we're seeing the GPU clock frequency increase to 1350 megahertz. And then when we go to the CPU test, as you can see, we're seeing the same story. So sort of fine-ish in the beginning of the test. Again, the CPU and GPU do reach 90 degrees, which definitely isn't great. And again, that is with 0.43% GPU load, and then we're seeing the memory clock speeds, the CPU clock speed, hovering around 4,500. But then as soon as those temperatures creep over that 90-degree threshold, we're seeing the clock speeds drop, and then again further drop. But the GPU memory clock frequency stays steady throughout the whole test, but then the GPU clock frequency drops to 100 megahertz. But again, this isn't a GPU test, so not too bothered about that. But again, definitely shows that when you are pushing this system, the CPU and GPU temperatures obviously being one in the same, because again they're all built in the same chip. The temperatures are too high to be really called comfortable. Definitely you want to be seeing the temperatures around 80 to maximum 85 degrees really with a system like this. So now I've got PC Mark 10 opened up, and this is a fantastic benchmark for Office use. So this will test Office applications that people will be using, for example, like web browsing, video conferencing, app startup, as it suggests. So this is quite a long benchmark, as you can see, 26 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this and get back to you with the results. So PC Mark 10 is completed and we get a score of 4,737. If we take a look at the CPU clock frequencies, it bumps up and down, as you can see, but it does reach close to its max turbo boost. If we take a look at CPU temperatures, these are more than manageable, reaching a maximum of 81 degrees throughout all of the different types of tests. So, you know, writing, it hits around sort of 45, and then doing spreadsheets definitely pushes it depending on what kind of spreadsheet work you are doing. But again, temperatures are all manageable. And then in terms of CPU power consumption, as you can see, it doesn't reach any more than really 30. When you are doing web browsing, it definitely does peak up to 32 to 33. But overall, this type of PC, the Intel Nook, definitely is more suited for sort of web browsing, office type work. Even with photo editing, it seems to be handling it fine. So if you have a look over here, let's look at the CPU temperatures. It definitely creeps up a little bit, but again, absolutely manageable. And again, it goes up and down, but hitting close to its turbo frequency.
Now let's run some Unigen tests to see how the GPU performs.
Right now we've got Unigen Heaven running, and we're running it at a resolution of 1080. Here are all the settings. I've got it set to the extreme preset, so I'm just going to press OK. So nothing to be surprised about, but we got a frames per second of 12.4 with a score of 312. Let's move on to the next Unigen test. So now we're running the Unigine Valley benchmark, and again kept things the same. This is running the Extreme HD preset, so let's close that and let's run the benchmark. With the Unigine Valley test all completed, we're getting 10.3 frames per second with a score of 431. Let's move on to the final Unigine test. So the last test we have is the superposition benchmark, and we're setting the preset to 1080p extreme, so let's run that. And the results are in. At the 1080p extreme preset, we have a score of 807. So overall, not too bad, especially in a small form factor like this. But what is it like to game? Now, I know it's not a gaming machine, but I know that you guys will want to know. So I fired up some games and gave it a go. Let's start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, as this is a very popular benchmark for gaming. And I will just let you know that loading this benchmark took an extremely long amount of time. And if we take a look at the final results, we get an average frames per second of 25. The minimums are pretty terrible at 19, 28 and 21. So yeah, not fantastic for this game. You definitely want to turn down the resolution. Okay, so I'm in Rocket League, and in order to get playable frame rates, I mean the 1% loads are definitely not great, but setting the textures and everything like that to performance and the render quality to performance, we are getting playable frame rates. So you know, it's around 60 frames per second. I mean, you can definitely see a little bit of screen tearing, and you can definitely feel it. You can definitely feel it struggling to play this game. But I mean, if you just want a quick session, I guess this could do. But I think the moral of the story is, even with AAA titles or anything like that, it's just not good for gaming, that is for sure. So I tried to run Cyberpunk 2077, and as you can see, it doesn't run. What a surprise. Using the PC for productivity tasks like editing Word documents, updating Excel spreadsheets, and web browsing worked really great. I had over 20 tabs open with multiple windows, and it didn't seem to slow down. I will say that the fans did kick in and were audible even with some light use, and would ramp up when I started to push the system. The fan noise tone wasn't annoying, which is good, but yes, you can hear the fans through these little vents. Now, I did run some DaVinci Resolve on this, and you can do some light video editing and photo editing at a push, but anything with 4K or high resolution images, and this just isn't the right machine for that. This is best for Microsoft Office suite of apps, light coding, and even watching some 4K Netflix and web surfing. So what do I think of this machine overall? I think that Intel has definitely created something very unique here. Now, yes, it's not going to be for everyone, especially if you are a gamer or a video editor or anything like that. But if you are doing office type work or even a student, then this could be a great option. I will say that look for the non-vPro option if you are a student, as you won't really need this option and you'll save yourself a few bucks. However, in an office, the vPro option is definitely something that you should look for, because the vPro certification gives a lot of features for enterprise work. Even a small form factor PC is nowhere near as small as this thing, and honestly I'm shocked at how well the Intel processor performs in such a small chassis. However, just be aware that the fans can be heard in certain situations, so if sound is more important to you than performance, then you can tweak the fan settings in the BIOS very easily, but you will be running the processor a little bit hotter and it will affect performance ever so slightly. I like the fact that it has Thunderbolt ports, so if you need more ports, I mean, these things are absolutely powerful, and you can grab one of SABRENT's many Thunderbolt accessories to expand its capabilities. Some users may find that there aren't enough ports in this thing, but I think for its size, it has more ports than most laptops. But that's it for today's video. If you've enjoyed it, then please make sure to hit that like button, and if you're new here, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you stay updated for all our videos. Anyway, we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
music be the movement, everybody